さっきキーヤちゃんがギルドに遊びに行ってたし。
ああ、今日は一日ギルドにいるだろうから。
Regardless of what niche gaming communities may say, this is the best time to be a Trails fan. Alongside the entirety of the Sky and Cold Steel sagas and confirmation of future releases, the West will finally be able to experience the Crossbell duology officially. The first entry, Trails from Zero, launched in fall of 2021, earning waves of new fans. And now, The Legend of Heroes Trails to Azure will capstone this specific saga. I have previous experience with this game after playing the fan translation and the Geofront iteration, which is what this release is fundamentally based on, so I knew what I was getting myself into. However, at the time, I was only familiar with the core story, which minimizes the impacts of the NPCs, reading materials, and general side content. Now, with the greater context of the cast and lore, I was eager to dive back into Azure and see everything as I took my time smelling the burning roses. Let's jump right in. After roughly 130 hours, I'm left with a somewhat mixed reception. While Trails to Azure boasts one of the strongest narratives in the series with brilliant political intrigue and tension, most of its cast, perhaps at a cost, suffers from lacking endearment and memorable interactions that cause some overall confusion. Still, there's plenty of fulfilling content to enjoy here for dedicated fans who take their time to investigate all of what this title has to offer. Before we get into the review, we'd just like to thank our Patreon supporters for making this possible. Please take a second to check out patreon.com/noisypixel to support independent game journalism. Following a brief time skip after the finale of Trails from Zero, Crossbell's special support section has seen structural changes. Randy Orlando, Ellie McDowell, and Teal Plateau are all temporarily pursuing paths of their own, and protagonist Lloyd Bannings is no exception. The prologue comprises the cleanup of the lingering Zero plot threads, simultaneously emphasizing the direct connectivity for those who may not have been aware beforehand, as well as the new treachery on the horizon of Crossbell. To help, the title screen does contain a backstory section housing key terms, character profiles, and a narrative summary of Trails from Zero, but those should not be seen as replacements for the actual experience. Instead, partially due to their brevity, fans of the first game should take a gander at these menus as a narrative recap. I'm sure I've said this before, but it's tough to discuss the stories of Trails games in non-spoiler terms since they require knowledge of the other entries. In the case of Trails to Azure, being both the sequel and the saga finale, this difficulty is amplified tenfold. Still, there are several talking points that can be brought up without fear of ruining the narrative. For instance, much of Trails to Azure orbits political stakes. Various matters regarding Crossbell's uniquely precarious geopolitical conflicts are touched on, but Azure makes those facets far more pronounced and focused. The Erebonian Empire and the Republic of Calvar's intense vying for the locale caused the citizens and government to face more tension than ever before, as it even branches the fantastical notion of independence. As a result, there are moments of concurrent inferiority and prosperity within Crossbell. The citizens clash with high taxation beyond their control, alongside a sense that the land and its people do not belong to themselves. As several vain Erebonian and Calvardian visitors not so subtly imply, Crossbell resides with one nation or the other, not itself. These political themes are undoubtedly where Trails to Azure is at its strongest. Not only is the concept compelling since it has the capacity to unite countless individuals of differing backgrounds, but the city is the only like it in the game's world. If you're invested in Trails lore and world building, Azure will likely be one of your favorites for those aspects alone. There is plenty here to digest, resulting in a dense, rich-filled world. Further, due to this official English release occurring after the localization of Trails of Cold Steel Saga, players of those games will glean additional context that will bring to light just how well written this series is. On that same note, it's worth bringing up that every localized version of Azure uses the PlayStation 4 Kai Japanese version as the base, and includes a few Cold Steel cameos since, for those unaware, the events of Azure happen at roughly the same time of Trails of Cold Steel 1 and 2. Now, while I have sung this game's praises, some aspects are underwhelming, such as the handling of the cast. In Trails from Zero, I wasn't a fan of the special support section or several of the supporting characters, and that unfortunately carries over here. In a sense, this sequel has doubled both the pros and cons of its predecessor. To elaborate, like Zero, Lloyd and Ellie are easily the weakest members of the core cast. They have a handful of engaging interactions, yet Lloyd ultimately feels too affixed to the narrative, not giving enough scenes to understand his personal challenges. Ellie, on the other hand, lacks presence, only receiving some of the spotlight in the later hours that is sadly sidelined and only given the bare minimum of attention. Noelle, who is far more present this time around, suffers from a loosely similar issue as Ellie, where the crux of her character conflict is initiated and rapidly concluded in the span of a few in-game hours near the conclusion. Plus, essential parts of her backstory are provided during an optional dialogue. Granted, it's not like everyone needs a thought-provoking deep dive every time they're seen on screen, but when their characterizations and growth are rushed or lacking in favor of progressing the plot, attachment has a tendency to wane. Tio is an excellent example of a party member who isn't a strong focus but provides endearing and effective support. However, this only works because she was such a highlight in Zero, so the foundation of care was already established and developed long beforehand. Thankfully, if you collect all of a character's room decorations, you'll initiate a short slice of life scene invoking them and Lloyd. More events of this variety would have drastically aided the depiction of character relationships. Moreover, the villains are where I'd argue Azure is at his weakness. Aside from a few select antagonists with gripping and sympathetic motivations, the majority were so typically evil with mustache-twirling dialogue that made it difficult to take them seriously. Most Trails games have this to varying extents, yet it feels more pronounced here. It should go without saying that mileage will vary from player to player. Still, several events that were meant to be emotionally significant fell short because the antagonist's dialogue was usually at odds with the core narrative. Randy, for example, is the best character in this game, bar none. His intentions were teased enough in Zero for his arc in Azure to feel naturally fleshed out. In a different vein is Wazi, who, similar to Noelle, is far more active in this entry, yet is far more compelling for reasons I can't discuss here. Unfortunately, the antagonists who act as their primary obstacles were weakly depicted, resulting in a loss of potential. Still, I always enjoyed their dialogue, which complemented their endearing strife. And aside from Tio, Dieter Kreuss is the only other character that I found received this necessary character growth treatment. Of course, prioritizing narrative over characterization is never an inherent flaw, but in the case of the story, there were bizarre occurrences that illustrate either a lack of development time or oversights. There are vital and crucial plot events that are sidelined and only given a few sentences of summation. I should emphasize that this is not the norm throughout Azure, it just happens at a few points that should have been significantly expanded on. There are critical events in Zero treated similarly, so it's disappointing to see this carry over to a greater capacity. Contrary to this, I had a pretty fun time with Azure, and that's because of how gameplay is approached. Firstly, combat has undergone an evolution, adopting a Sepith value system seen in Zero and the Sky Trilogy, as well as introducing Master Quartz, a mechanic many initially associate with the Cold Steel series. These new quartz act as vehicles for further character individuality, being instilled with stat increases and select abilities. Additionally, maxing a Master Quartz level grants a notable art that can turn the tide of battle. It's a simple yet effective system that enhances progression. Combat has received the Burst Meter, which is only present in climactic story segments, letting the player stop enemy turns once the gauge is full, granting the party numerous turns one after another alongside a slew of benefits. Due to how potent this functionality is, the evident facets of strategy arise from identifying the most effective times to use it. Arts can be immediately used with no charging in bursts, so they're certainly the first tool many will go to. On another note, combination crafts known as Duo S-crafts earned in the later hours of Zero are also present in Azure, except this time from the beginning, and the pacing of their distribution is far quicker. These abilities are reliable since, unlike standard S-crafts, they don't sap all the character CP if it's above 100, and they're typically fantastic for crowd control. Cooking, quests, collectibles, and such all function identically to Zero, though fishing is cleverly implemented. Since players would have already seen most of the fishing spots and catches in Zero, a mini storyline was added this time around to justify the resets of progress. Simply put, the fishing guild is taken over by Imperial Fishers, who control select fishing spots outside of the Crossbell City, and it's up to the main man himself, Lloyd Bannings, to challenge these Imperial Fishers, known as the Elite Four, to wrest free reign of these spots once more. However, the prerequisites for facing off against these foes alter depending on who it is, so the process is kept fresh. I probably enjoyed the fishing too much, as it's as addicting as ever. As a brief aside, there's a slight problem with cooking. Unlike Zero, the party houses more than 4 members on a usual basis. also allowing for additional opportunities for preparation. Unfortunately, cooking only allows the 4 characters in the active party to be selectable, so any characters in the back line can't be chosen unless you manually change the party lineup. This problem is incredibly minor, but it's at least worth acknowledging since it's a definite oversight. Fast travel is easier in Azure, partially thanks to an early availability of a vehicle the cast can utilize to get anywhere immediately. It's more convenient than bus stops since you aren't restricted to specific spots. Further, you can instantly warp the car back to the SSS garage whenever you like. But for reasons I can't pinpoint, there are some occasions where the car would just straight up vanish. Ordinarily, the car is presented as an icon on the map, but I found myself in scenarios where it was gone entirely, and using the warp function to spawn it in the garage would result in a softlock where the game did not know what to do, leaving me stuck on the map screen with no way to exit other than closing the game. Thankfully, at least for the PC version, there are autosaves, so I didn't lose too much progress. Still, this glitch reared its ugly head 4 times for me, so just be careful and maybe save before if you ever use the car. Regarding cities and towns, Azure suffers from the same flaws as Zero, where despite the low number of areas, they're presented to be far smaller than they actually are in the context of the story. And in Azure, where politics takes center stage more than ever before, this issue comes off as more prominent. I could very well be in the minority here, whose immersion was broken by this since every game ever made requires some kind of suspension of disbelief. Yet, when considering the massive scale and premise of Azure's narrative and how other sagas aren't contained within a singular city, the minuscule depiction of Crossbell City proper, not to mention its surrounding villages, causes a collective loss of impact. I guess the best way to put it is that it's easier and less contrived to suspend belief in scenarios where you explore a multitude of areas, since expecting fleshed out depictions across them all just isn't feasible. Clear data from Zero can be transferred over to Azure, impacting countless interactions subtly depending on what the player did throughout the former. For instance, several scenes slightly change if you cleared certain side quests in Zero, spoke to a particular NPC, and who Lloyd had its final bonding with. This implementation is not new, as Trails in the Sky SC and Trails of Cold Steel games did something similar, but its strengths can't be overstated. This effort doesn't go unnoticed, since everyone's playthrough will be tailored based on their previous actions. Of course, it's not like the narrative will alter dramatically, but if you take the time to speak to all NPCs and pay attention during select exchanges, you'll catch on to specific references that a default save file wouldn't have. And speaking of NPCs, Trails to Azure thrives on them. Throughout the narrative, there are some named NPCs with mini storylines of their own that are fun to follow. While it is very possible I missed dialogue here and there, especially given this title's script size, I took my time and aimed to talk to everyone in the game across every instance of changed dialogue. As for the usual elephant in the room, the localization, I did encounter several minor typos, usually just missing or misplaced periods or commas with the occasional merged word, although I did also see 2 text boxes that erroneously copied and pasted the text from the previous text box. Other than those slip-ups though, the localization appeared magnificent, so I would not worry about its quality. Despite it being a time-consuming process, it was a rewarding experience since it partially aided in me feeling a higher degree of affinity for the townspeople. Further, with the stronger political focus, seeing different perspectives and thoughts from the common folk rather than simply the big players was a nice change of pace. Granted, the small size of Crossbell harmed the believability of certain developments, but the NPC quality was by no means poor. Lastly, like Trails from Zero, Azure contains New Game Plus only content, providing a few new boss battles and a super boss. These encounters aren't overly significant since they are only there for those seeking achievements, but replay value in games like these is always appreciated. The Legend of Hero Trails to Azure is an entry every fan should experience in all of its glory. Aside from its integral narrative importance to the series at large, its gameplay progress, divine soundtrack, and brilliant political engagement make it a worthy sequel. While I don't think it comes close to the other entries in the franchise due to the story focus taking precedence over the cast and missed events that would have provided greater impact, I was hooked all the same. The intricacy of Trails rivals most gaming series you'll find out there, and in a personal sense, Azure demonstrates that even if it stumbles with delivery, as it still manages to comprise an unforgettable experience. Noisy Pixel is giving The Legend of Heroes Trails to Azure a 7 out of 10. Thanks for watching. This video is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon. Noisy Pixel is run by a group of gamers providing independent gaming coverage through news, reviews, previews, and more. Check out our Patreon to help support our continued growth and subscribe to keep up with all our future content.
Noisy Pixel.